I'm your host, Misty Maris. We're live in the courtroom during the Quentin Tellis case. The court just on recess for a lunch break. We anticipate they will be back in about an hour. We heard from a variety of first responders on the scene who arrived to see the horrific sight of Jessica Chambers seeking for desperate help after being burned in her car. I have Cathy Russon, our senior trial producer here at LawNewz, with me to go through some of the facts that we learned today. Cathy, so we heard from a variety of firefighters, EMT, first responders who were on the scene. First of all, some chilling testimony about the state of Jessica Chambers and her desperate cries for help. This is definitely an emotional case for both the family members and the jury.
Yeah, horrific. It's absolutely horrific. I think it heard from 8 maybe firefighters and first responders, really with basically the same story. And so they just put them up one after another after another. As a matter of fact, the prosecutor said, when the judge said, "Do you have a short witness before lunch?" And he said, "I'm just going to put the last 2 firefighters on, so we're done with that part." So they just got all of them up at first. Pictures were shown today of Jessica's body, and the firefighter on the stand that was shown that started choking up, and it's when she was still alive. It's so horrific. I can't even begin to imagine what her parents are going through, because the descriptions that every first responder is giving of how she was when they came upon her was awful. And here's the thing, she was conscious and she was talking, and she actually spoke to multiple people. Now, so what was she feeling? You know, was she feeling that amount of pain? Is your body in so much shock that you're not? I don't know, but she was able to talk to them. Now, we have to get into what the common theme is, right?
Absolutely.
With all of these firefighters. And that is, she told every one of them what they thought they heard was, "Eric did this. Eric did this to me. Eric set me on fire. Eric, 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 Eric." That's not Quentin Tellis. So what the state is saying is that her mouth was burned so badly, and her esophagus and her lungs, and that she was not able to speak well. Now, we did have one of the firefighters say that, maybe 2 of them said that when she was trying to say her name, they couldn't figure it out at first, and they thought lots of different names, and then finally they figured out she was saying Jessica. So we do know that she was having a hard time talking, and they were having a hard time understanding. But one of them said, "What's Eric's last name?" And she said, "I don't know." If this was Quentin Tellis, I'm presuming she knew his last name. She'd been dating him for a couple of months.
No, Cathy, you make some excellent points, and that is absolutely the common theme with these witnesses. So they were put on the stand. They're fact witnesses. They're testifying as to what they saw. Of course, some of that testimony implicating this horrific pain and suffering that Jessica went through during that time. That is something that, as you said, certainly tugs at the heartstrings. The family must be reeling over this situation. But the second piece, and the piece that really speaks to the legal case here, is the fact that she identified the person, an identification which will come into court, we've already seen it, as a dying declaration that Jessica Chambers identified somebody named Eric as the person that set her on fire. Now, of course, we know that this was something the defense brought up right from the get-go in their opening statements, that it's Eric, maybe Derek, and the prosecution trying to undercut that, talking about some of that the medical issues that you brought up, her esophagus being charred, the fact that she was in total shock. Was she even in the right state of mind to know what she was talking about? But you pointed out the piece that I heard, thinking as an attorney, well, if she was able, number one, to eventually communicate her name to these first responders, she had at least some wherewithal. The second piece, she said she did not know the assailant's last name. And that is going to be something we're absolutely going to see the defense harness. So, Cathy, given those circumstances, what else do we have to tie Quentin Tellis to this case? We know the prosecution said this is going to be a lot of phone information, a lot of phone data, text messages, and all that. What do we know about the link between Quentin Tellis and Jessica Chambers?
Okay, so his DNA was found on her car keys that were on the road. Okay, so that puts him in the car. However, he admitted to law enforcement that he was with her that day, and he said they had sex in the car. And so that's easily explained away, in my opinion, his DNA being on the keys. However, there is more to that. He admits, he tells that they had sex and that they had the seat put back in the reclining position. That is how her seat was found. So she didn't drive off after him, after having sex with him and dropping him off with the seat reclined back. So that is a key that prosecution has talked about in court, about the reclining seat, the DNA on the keys. Now, other than that, they had nothing until they pulled cell phone records in the related case in Louisiana.
And so that's really what we anticipate the story will unfold as we review some of those records. And Cathy, that was a murder charge, correct? That case in Louisiana that actually implicated Quentin Tellis in this case. That's where the source of the information came.
Right. So months after Jessica's death, Quentin Tellis marries his girlfriend, which, by the way, apparently was his girlfriend while he was seeing Jessica. He marries her, and they move to Louisiana. Days after moving to Louisiana, a woman ends up stabbed 30 times and to death. And they can link Quentin to her. One, they have him on surveillance camera at a Walmart together. And then two, her debit card was stolen and money stolen through the ATM. And they have his cell phone records calling the number that's on the back of her debit card. That's where they linked him to her. And they immediately arrested him with the stealing of the credit card, and then eventually charged him with her murder. So when they started investigating in that case, that's when they started looking at cell phone records closer, and they claimed, we haven't seen the cell phone testimony yet, but they claimed that could put him with Jessica and around the time and around the car burning that area when he said he wasn't with her. And that's the key, because he admits being with her.
Right. The plot thickens here, Cathy, and that certainly is a twist. Do we know how much, if any of that, is going to come into the courtroom? Have there been evidentiary hearings about those other charges? Generally, that would not. That would be, there's no conviction there, so there wouldn't be any discussion of that in the courtroom. But has that issue come up yet in some of the pretrial evidentiary hearings?
Right. Yeah, they cannot bring in the Louisiana charges.
Which makes sense from an evidence standpoint, but certainly critical information that was obtained throughout the process of investigating that case. Now, you brought up a point that I think is very, very important, and that's the location of the seat in the car, that it remained reclined. Because when we're talking about Quentin Tellis and his side of the story, at least what we know from the defense perspective, Cathy, correct me if I'm wrong, but originally Quentin Tellis was not truthful with investigators about his about being with Jessica Chambers on that day, but eventually turned around and admitted that they were together on the day in question, but obviously that he was not responsible for the burning of her car, but that the seat being back tends to contradict that. Now, we also know that the defense made a point. There's really two ideas that the defense seems to be harnessing here. The first, which I think is going to be their strongest, is the dying declaration. The fact that this name Eric or Derek was stated multiple times to multiple people, consistent. Eric is the person who burned me, according to Jessica Chambers during that dying declaration. But a second piece is the defense in their opening statement said that Quentin Tellis has an alibi, that he was using his debit card somewhere else too far away to actually make it back to this location. Do we know more about that, or do we anticipate that's going to be contradicted by these phone records?
We don't know. So that's the defense says, look, we have proof that he wasn't there at the time of her death, that he was out buying a green dot card. I'm not familiar with what that is, but that they can prove that he was off doing that. So we're going to see that come in. I took notes of the timeline during both the state and the defense openings, and then through a couple of witnesses like Jessica's mom. So we could go through that really quickly. This is what we know. And what we know is Jessica picked up Quentin earlier in the day, and then they went and picked up their friend Keisha, which is Jessica's best friend. And then just drove around. Keisha already testified that they just drove around and whatever for an hour or two and just kind of hung out. Then Jessica dropped Quentin back off at his house first, and then dropped off Keisha at her house. And she went home, and her mom testified she came in and she took a nap. Then she got woken up from her nap to a phone call or a text. Can't remember which. And at 5, a little after 5, she leaves the house. And at 5:30, she picks up Quentin Tellis, and they go to Taco Bell and hang out. Jessica's mom says at 6:48 p.m. she gets a call from Jessica, and that normally when Jessica calls when she's out and about in her car, there's always music blaring in the car, and there wasn't anything like that. It was silent, and that led Jessica's mom to believe someone else was in the car with her. So that was an interesting piece of testimony. Then at 7 o'clock, Quentin Tellis says Jessica Chambers dropped him off and left his house. So he claims that's the last time he saw her, was at 7. At 7:42, Quentin Tellis calls Jessica Chambers' phone and then leaves a text message saying, "Honey, sorry I can't be there with you tonight." And then says he can't see her because his girlfriend was coming up to see him. Okay? So now he leaves a message saying that. But then, after he leaves that message, they have phone records of Quentin Tellis calling his girlfriend after he sends the text to Jessica saying, "My girlfriend's coming up." At 7:50 p.m., surveillance camera footage from the M&M convenience store across the street from Quentin Tellis' house shows a car pull into his driveway up to a shed. And Quentin Tellis apparently at one point in time has admitted to having gas in that shed. Okay, that's where I am. That's where I am with the timeline of what went down. And this is how they're putting together their circumstantial case, right? With him saying that after 7 he didn't see her again, but then they have a car pulling up to his shed, and they believe that that is, and also they asked him about what kind of vehicles he had to drive, and he had, shoot, I wish I remembered, but I didn't feel like he had a car. Like I felt like he had a moped or I don't know, something else. But a car pulls up to that shed.
Cathy, that is such excellent information. Thank you so much to put that all together for us, because there has been such a barrage of information that has come out of just these past few days of trial that really it's so helpful to have it laid out as you did. And really, that's the story that the prosecution is going to be telling. As you said, this is how they're going to put together their circumstantial case. As you pointed out, the DNA evidence in this case is pretty lackluster, actually, because if Quentin Tellis is admitting that he was in the car, you'll find any DNA expert from a defense standpoint that will say, look, if he was in the car, very easily his DNA could have been on the keys, been on other parts of the car, especially since they were engaged in a sexual act, according to his version of the story. So that's really going to not be so great for the prosecution. What also is important is what we spoke about before, and that's what we saw in this testimony today. This dying declaration, Eric or something of the like, and the victim not knowing the last name of her assailant. But Cathy, isn't it true that Jessica Chambers only knew Quentin Tellis for about 2 weeks prior to this day? Isn't that what we've heard so far?
Right. He just got out, by the way, out of jail, and was on probation in October of 2014. And this happened December 6th of 2014. And shortly after getting out and returning to Portland, I guess where he lives, friends introduced him to Jessica. So where we have heard on one hand 2 weeks, others have said maybe longer than that. Maybe she didn't know his last name. I don't know. Maybe you're just hanging with a guy and it's very casual and it's new, and maybe she doesn't know his last name. That's a possibility.
Yeah, it's possibly something we could see the prosecution argue as we get to that point, because of course the defense, I'm sure, is going to be latching onto that very strongly when they try and poke holes and raise reasonable doubt in the case.
Well, of course, that's their whole case. The defense opening was so short. It was so short because it was, look, Eric did this, go find an Eric. Wasn't my client. He was gone. He was somewhere else, and the phone records will show it. Oh, he was somewhere else, and I think it says debit card records will show it, something like that. And that phone records are inaccurate. So that was the theme of their opening. Because really, I think really they're just placing him at the scene through phone records.
Right. They're saying
the DNA on Mickey.
Yeah, you got the wrong guy, is essentially, and as you said, the defense, it was, I mean, I believe it was not even, it was about 10 minutes. It was a very short opening, and really, just, you've got the wrong guy, as you said. We know it's somebody named Eric. Why aren't you finding an Eric? And also this debit card issue. Well, Cathy, I think what we do know is we can anticipate when you've got a case that involves phone records and the like, we're going to see some expert testimony as this case moves forward on both sides. If the defense is arguing that the records aren't accurate, certainly we'll be seeing some sort of cell phone data expert who will attest to that. Do we know any other types of experts that we can anticipate seeing as this case moves forward?
I have the witness list here. Definitely we're going to see cell phone records. I think we will also see an expert on when the defense says that Tellus was somewhere else making a purchase. So we'll see that. I'm telling you, the witness list is full of, which we've already seen, firefighters, EMS, sheriff's office, two pages of those type of witnesses. There's an FBI agent on the list, the crime lab, so ATF crime lab will come because of the fire. Yeah, another ATF guy, biological, another crime scene lab, and 2 FBI agents are on the list. So
yeah, certainly a lot of witnesses in this case, absolutely. And today we heard
40 witnesses.
40 witnesses. Wow. That's a lot of witnesses, and certainly today we heard from all of those firefighters, first responders. One more question, Cathy, before we review a little bit of what we've seen so far in the trial. We spoke about the graphic photos that was shown to one of the witnesses on the stand that actually caused him to break down into tears because of that emotional response of just thinking about this horrific situation that Jessica Chambers was in and understanding that she must have been in such shock and pain. Now, the prosecution came out the gate and said, look, you're going to see some photographs in this case that are going to be very shocking to the system. Now, sometimes photographs like that aren't allowed in the courtroom. It seems that here that evidentiary issue has already been decided that they're not, they're more probative than prejudicial, and therefore the jury will see them. Has the jury seen those photographs yet, or is that to come in the jury's hands?
That will be yet to come. Yeah, they're going to allow them to see photos of her burned mouth, the inside of her mouth, the burned esophagus. But the reason they're allowing that, the judge is allowing that, is that goes to the state's theory that you couldn't make out what she was saying when she was saying Eric. And that's where they're going with the Eric thing, is they're saying that they all misunderstood that it was Eric, which I find that there's 8 of them. And anyway, they all misunderstood that it was Eric. So they're going to see that. They haven't seen that yet. What they did see today was a picture of her, just her panties and burned, and then a picture of her wrapped up in the blankets that they had given her. Which, you know, for me, it's amazing. She's sitting up, she's standing up and walking at one time. One of the responders gets on the scene and says, you know, she was standing there. So we went and got her, like, standing there. 93% of her body was burned. Horrific. And I have to go to the emotional part of this. This is a little tiny town. There's testimony today that it's 1 square mile, which is super tiny. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone that almost, not quite, but almost every one of those firefighters knew her, knew of her, had gone to high school with her. Nobody recognized her when they came up on the scene.
And it is really, to think of the imagery is really heart-wrenching, and that's not going to be lost on the jury, Cathy.
No, absolutely not. What else is not going to be lost is every one of those firefighters have choked up or outright cried, having to get tissues on the stand when they are asked to describe what she looked like. Then the fire chief, Cole Haley, he was the worst. He was so emotionally upset on the stand. And when he asked if he's a volunteer firefighter anymore, he said no. He said he can't do it anymore, and that he's afraid to leave his house because he now realizes there are evil people like that out there. He was an emotional wreck, and when he left the courtroom, I tweeted out the picture. He left the courtroom and stopped and hugged Jessica's dad.
Wow.
as he walked out.
That is absolutely, it's heart-wrenching. There's no other way to describe it. It is just such an emotional situation. And when you think about a professional, as you described, a firefighter who's likely seen a lot in the course of their career saying that they could not even move forward with their profession after this situation, it certainly is something that the jury is going to have in their mind. So the question becomes, this one critical issue seems to be what this case will turn on. The defense and the name Eric being uttered at the scene. And will the prosecution be able to overcome that with, as you said, the medical evidence was she's so badly burned that there's the chance that she wouldn't be able to effectively communicate or wouldn't have her wits about her or be able to, or everyone would misunderstand her. The problem is that for the prosecution, you just have so many people with the same story and the same name Eric that this could really be a factor that could raise reasonable doubt. Cathy Russon, senior trial producer for LawNewz, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you'll stick around, but I want to go back and review the prosecution's opening statement. Watch this and see, this is the roadmap of what we know the prosecution is going to try and prove. Cathy very eloquently set forth the timeline of what we've seen so far, but this will give us an idea of what's to come while we wait for court to come back.